The essential salts of animals may be so prepared and preserved that an ingenious man may have the whole Ark of Noah in his own study and raise the fine shape of an animal out of its ashes at his pleasure. And by the like method, from the essential salts of human dust, a philosopher may, without any criminal necromancy, call up the shape of any dead ancestor from the dust whereinto his body has been incinerated.
hppodcraft.com.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, that is the opening inscription for The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, a novel by H.P. Lovecraft.
And today we're going to start our adventure into the world of Charles Dexter Ward.
That reader was Matt Foyer. We are glad to have him back.
Matt Foyer, who is actor extraordinaire and star of the Call of Cthulhu film and the upcoming Whisper in Darkness.
I'm Chad Pfeiffer.
And I'm Chris Lackey, and this is the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
At hppodcraft.com. We're glad to be back after a couple of weeks off.
We took a couple weeks off. I was in Cyprus. You went to Alaska?
I did.
Actually, I read this in Cyprus. Well, I should say reread it, next to a pool. So not very mood-setting, but still a great story.
I did some reading on my vacation as well, up on the train, up in the Klondike, surrounded by mountains of madness, up in Alaska. It was pretty good. But it was a reread for me, too, because as I mentioned before, this is actually the first H.P. Lovecraft bit I ever read. I really love this book.
I do, too.
I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
And I rewatched the film adaptation, The Resurrected, just yesterday.
Yes.
The Dan O'Bannon adaptation, which we could talk about a little later.
Yeah.
I like that movie.
I do, too. I really enjoy that movie. And it's a very good, script-wise, great adaptation.
That opening inscription is a quote. Well, it says it's attributed to Borellus.
Pierre Borel is the guy that actually wrote that, and he lived from 1620 to 1689, and he was a French physician and chemist and botanist and things like that. Okay. But Cotton Mather translated that phrase into English, and it's in his Magnalia Christi Americana, which was written in 1702, and H.P. Lovecraft had a copy of that, and that's probably where he got the quote from.
So he pulled this from Mather.
Yeah.
Well, it kind of tells us what we're dealing with in this story, raising up animals or men from their ashes or their remains through some kind of chemical process or alchemy. That's what's going to be happening in the story. It spans a couple of centuries, but let's go ahead and dig into the first part.
A result and a prologue. From a private hospital for the insane near Providence, Rhode Island, there recently disappeared an exceedingly singular person. He bore the name of Charles Dexter Ward and was placed under restraint most reluctantly by the grieving father who had watched his aberration grow from a mere eccentricity to a dark mania involving both a possibility of murderous tendencies and a profound and peculiar change in the apparent contents of his mind. Doctors confessed themselves quite baffled by his case, since it presented oddities of a general physiological as well as psychological character.
Now, there's an introduction to our titular character, Charles Dexter Ward. And, if it's a case of somebody, that means they got to have some problems, and these are the problems that he has.
He definitely has a pretty serious problem.
When they admitted Charles to the insane asylum, he seemed a lot older than he should have been.
Yeah.
His voice is gone.
He can only talk in whispers and in a raspy voice.
And there's the detail they say is that his tissue was all kind of loosely knit.
Yeah.
Like his skin and tissue were a little like saggy and weird.
Right. And he had there's a birthmark that was on him that was gone.
Yeah, he's missing a birthmark, although it seems like he acquired another one.
Yeah, on his chest, a blackish spot. Yeah.
Psychologically, however, he actually seems almost smarter than he used to be. Like he's got a great capacity for knowledge, although
however,
there's a giant gap in his memory of all modern things seem to be gone.
Yes. He's an antiquarian, and so he's really obsessed with the past, and he seems to be very knowledgeable about those things, but not about modern-day things.
Yeah, that's what's odd, is that Charles Dexter Ward loved the past, but once they bring him into the hospital, he's actually more concerned with modernity. He wants to learn everything he can about what he already should know.
Yeah.
In this first few paragraphs of the book, we also introduce Dr. Willett, who's sort of the real main character of the story in a way.
Yeah, he's the Ward's family physician. He's known Charles since he was a little boy.
Yeah, in fact, he delivered him, I believe.
Yeah.
And he was the last person with Charles before Charles escaped.
Yes.
Which is a strange escape. There was a window in his room, but there's a drop of 60 feet from the window. So nobody's really sure how he got out of there.
Or that he survived, how he survived the drop from the window. And also, when the attendants knocked on the door and nobody was inside, and they finally opened it up and looked in there, and the window was open and he was gone, but there was this strange kind of ashy dust in the air, this kind of blue-green dust that choked them.
Now, Dr. Willett, I would assume everybody would think had some kind of complicity in the escape, but he says he doesn't really know what happened.
Yeah.
And he just seems relieved somehow. And Charles is still at large.
He's on the prowl out there in the wild.
in the wilds of Providence. So the alienists,
yes,
we start to get into a little bit of what do people think happened to Charles? I mean, why is he acting this way? What's with all the mental and physical changes? The alienists, they think he started losing it between 1919 and 1920 when he was real young.
Mm-hmm.
He was a teenager. He always, as we've said, cared a lot about history and the history of Providence and his family and genealogy and that sort of thing. But his researchers kind of went into the occult.
Yeah, and that's when they think he started going a little crazy.
And he started searching for the grave of this ancestor.
Yes, Joseph Curwen. Nobody knew that he was actually related to him because Joseph Curwen was married to this woman and she had a girl. But then something happened, and Joseph Curwen seems to have been erased from history.
Right. This was sort of a discovery by Charles, and he started investigating this character more. And Dr. Willett thinks it was actually, after this discovery, his researchers went a little crazy, but Charles was still pretty intact. He thinks it was much later that Charles really lost it in about 1928.
Yeah.
The true madness, he is certain, came with a later change, after the Curwen portrait and the ancient papers had been unearthed. After a trip to strange foreign places had been made and some terrible invocations chanted under strange and secret circumstances. After certain answers to these invocations had been plainly indicated, and a frantic letter penned under agonizing and inexplicable conditions. After the wave of vampirism and the ominous Patuxet gossip, and after the patient's memory commenced to exclude contemporary images whilst his voice failed, and his physical aspect underwent the subtle modification so many subsequently noticed.
So he thinks it was only after all of this that Charles went mad.
Yeah. And by the way, wave of vampirism?
Yeah.
Just throw that in there. Oh, there's just a wave of vampirism.
Well, that's what this is the first chapter of the first section, and it really grabs you.
Oh yeah,
you know?
heck yeah!
It's all about suggestion. Lovecraft doesn't explain anything.
No.
He just says Ward found this portrait. There's some really crazy things that happened. Willett thinks that all of this is really real. Wasn't manufactured by Ward.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Ward really did find this diary and this portrait, and these things belong to Curwen. And, you know, at the end of this chapter, there's a really horrible suggestion where Willett says he actually produced some hideous results himself using some formulae. And that's what really tipped him into thinking that there's a lot more going on than just Charles Ward going insane.
Yeah. This is a great setup. After us going through the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, which was really hard to keep focused on, I found with this story, it was more of a page-turner for me.
Absolutely. You just rip right through it, you know. And it's interesting how we said, you know, with Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, Lovecraft was just sort of making an experiment in the novel form so he could get better at it. And this is a better example of a novel.
It is.
I mean, he learned a lot. He did a much better job with this. Now, this, like Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, was not published in his lifetime, though, right?
No, it wasn't.
It was published in the 40s, I think, a few years after he was dead. And I don't think that
41.
he himself really had a high opinion. Yeah, 41. I don't think he had a real high opinion
No,
of
it
this
wasn't yet. In a
himself.
letter, he was talking to a friend of his and just said that it was kind of, when he was older, this was like in the 30s, you know, years after he wrote the story, and he just thought it was kind of amateurish.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I disagree.
I disagree with
yeah,
that.
I disagree. I think it's totally great.
And I think Lovecraft in general had a low opinion of his own work. Really, anytime we found a reference of him talking about one of his own stories, he barely has anything good to say about any of his own stuff. Now, in the second chapter of this first section, we get to know Charles a bit. We meet him in his junior years, and when he's at the Moses Brown School, a junior.
Yeah.
He's tall, he's slim, he's blonde, and he's awkward. And he likes to walk around a lot.
He likes to walk around a lot.
Yeah, I mean, he goes on these little adventures.
Oh, yes, I know what you mean.
Adventures in antiquity. He
Oh,
walks
boy,
around
does
town
he.
and he looks at all the old houses and the old buildings. And this chapter really digs into all of that stuff. And it's, you know, more of Lovecraft's very detailed picture of what Providence was like
Yeah.
at the time.
Yeah, there's about 4 or 5, maybe even 6 paragraphs of just descriptions of buildings.
Right. You know, if you're interested in Providence, historical Providence, then you're going to love this.
Yeah.
Um,
And remember,
if you're
when I
not,
said
you know.
page turning, this was the part that I wasn't really turning the page here because it just... Yeah, I mean, it goes on for a long time. And
Or you were only turning the page. Charles lives in this great Georgian mansion atop a hill, and I think that's based on the Halsey house.
yeah.
We don't need to go into all the details of all the houses that he talks about, but it just shows, this section shows how obsessive he is about the past.
Right.
It says this accounts for all the antiquarian lore which had crowded the modern world from his mind, and it illustrates the mental soil upon which fell the seeds that came to such a strange
And
and terrible
fruition.
fruition. I thought that was a cool way to ride it. Now, he loved walking around and seeing all these buildings from the past and that sort of thing, but he wasn't really a morbid guy.
No.
He didn't hang around
He wasn't
graveyards.
into, dead things or cemeteries or any of that stuff. He just was into history.
Until he discovers this long-lived ancestor
Right.
who had come from Salem in 1692.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the start of when his morbidity fell into place.
That really gets his interest. He begins to really, really research.
That would be really exciting to find out that you had an ancestor, a great-great-great-grandfather who people were deliberately trying to pretend didn't exist. I mean, anybody would go nuts for that.
Specifically, I mean, a conspiracy. It seemed like there was a conspiracy going on to erase this man from existence.
I work for an advertising agency.
Mm-hmm.
I know on our website it says that we're filmmakers, but we both have jobs. We're not those successful kinds of filmmakers.
No.
But we were pitching a client that is one of these websites that's genealogical.
Mm-hmm.
It's really cool. So I signed up for the site as part of the pitch. I wanted to know how the process worked and started pulling records on my family. And this site has a ton of census records and military records, and it also links you out to other people's family trees, so you can discover a lot quite quickly. And I don't know anything about the paternal side of my family at all. My dad was born in 24, but things didn't go well in his home. My grandmother had died in the early 30s of tuberculosis, and he didn't get on well with his father. So I just don't know anything about that side of the family. Right. And suddenly all these names started coming up. I found out that my great grandfather was named Isaac Newton Pfeiffer, and which is awesome. And then his father was named Nimrod Pfeiffer.
Oh, nice!
Yeah, Nimrod Pfeiffer of Virginia. So I always knew that side of the family came from Germany, but actually not all of it. The paternal side that the Pfeiffer name comes from goes all the way back to colonial Virginia.
Wow!
And there's several Nimrods in the family.
Well, I think that
I don't know. I was like, wow, I'm descended from Nimrod.
I'm thinking when you and Heather decide to have children, that Nimrod should be at the top of the list of names.
It's possible.
It's a family
yeah.
name. It's a family name, Chad.
Exactly. But I got so excited about that. I mean, those discoveries are so cool.
Yeah, and that's just.
I can see why somebody would get, and that's above board.
Yeah, and that's just a few names.
Nobody tried to erase
names. That's not somebody trying to be erased from existence, which
Yeah.
means that there's something to hide. And if people are trying to hide something, you want to know what it is.
Exactly. And that brings us into the second chapter or second section of the book.
An antecedent and a horror. Joseph Curwen, as revealed by the rambling legends embodied in what Ward heard and unearthed, was a very astonishing, enigmatic, and obscurely horrible individual. He'd fled from Salem to Providence, that universal haven of the odd, the free, and the dissenting, at the beginning of the great witchcraft panic, being in fear of accusation because of his solitary ways and queer chemical or alchemical experiments. He was a colorless-looking man of about 30, and was soon found qualified to become a freeman of Providence, thereafter buying a home lot just north of Gregory Dexter's at about the foot of Olney Street. His house was built on Stamper's Hill west of the town street, in what later became Olney Court, and in 1761 he replaced this with a larger one on the same site, which is still standing.
Right away, I did the math on that when I was reading, and I was like, 1761, he built a new house? And he came over in 1692? That means he was like 99 years old when he was building the new house.
Exactly, yeah. He was, and that's part of Joseph Curwen's problems, is that he is extremely long-lived.
And I think he tells everybody in town, he's like, well, I have good, I'm from good stock.
Yeah.
I exercise and I eat right.
Uh-huh.
But people, already they see that he keeps these strange hours. There's strange lights coming out of his house. He's always mixing and boiling chemicals and that sort of thing.
And in fact, people in the town go to him for medicine. So he would make potions and things for people to help them with their problems. But, sometimes they would work, sometimes they wouldn't. So, obviously they were...
It's just snake oil.
Yeah, the placebos. He wasn't, just trying to get rid of them, get them out of his hair.
It says that he aged only 5 years in 50 years. It's like Beverly Hills. He also hangs out in graveyards. People notice. That's not a good thing.
Yeah, no, they didn't like that. And not only does he have this townhouse, he also has a farm.
Right, out in the Patuxent Valley.
Yeah, and it's not just him. He has these two servants, a husband who was dumb and curiously scarred, and he had a wife with a very repulsive cast of countenance. I thought that was a pretty funny way to say she's ugly.
Yeah, she's ugly, and it says probably due to a mixture of Negro blood.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is American literature, and it wouldn't be complete if it didn't have some kind of racial tension in it, so there you go.
There you go.
people out at that farm, people don't like that farm also because he gets these huge deliveries of strange things at all odd hours.
Crazy bottles, boxes, and they all come in through the rear door.
And he keeps too much livestock. I mean, if it's just he and his servants out there, why does he need all of this livestock?
Very strange.
And there's, next to the farm also there's this sort of stone tower, right? Mm-hmm. The Fenners, who are the closest neighbors, they'll hear cries coming from that stone tower all the time. There's some weird stuff's going on out there.
That's really weird and creepy, and you would think people would raise a bit more of a ruckus if they were hearing people screaming and crying and freaking out. Mm-hmm. They're like, what's going on in there?
Yeah. Now, Kerwin's got some advantages because he is from a family that is well known in New England. I mean, he's of good birth.
Yeah. He's
really antisocial, but people aren't completely... I mean, it's not like he's some crazy hermit who showed up out of nowhere.
No.
He's, his family's well known, so he can get away with some eccentricities, including these.
Yeah, well, he went away. He went overseas, went to school in England, and even went to the Orient. And so he has the speech of a refined Englishman.
And there's rumors about people who visited him. There's this Dr. Checkley, the famous wit from Boston, who came by and says,
"Mr. Chuckles."
Oh, yeah, I'd like to meet this guy, Mr. Chuckles. Well, Dr. Checkley, he's a real guy, Dr. Checkley.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was an advocate of the Church of England. There was a lot of religious intolerance at the time, actually, because of the puritanical way was supposed to be the only way. He represented the Church of England, and I don't know too much about him, but he's supposed to be a very funny guy, and he's a very good speaker, and I think he went on trial actually for defending religious tolerance in Boston later in life. So there's a little call out
to actual history. Yeah.
And then this guy John Merritt, who I don't know if he's real or not. He's an elderly English gentleman. He shows up. Now Kerwin actually digs this guy because he's very educated, and he shows up to Kerwin. He's like, "Hey, I hear you have the best library in Providence. I'd like to get a look at some of your books." Mm-hmm. And Kerwin's like, "Sure, let's go out to the farm and I'll show them to you."
Yeah.
And then you have one of those great paragraphs where he just lists off evil tomes.
Yeah, lots of... Well, I mean, it doesn't start off too evil. Just some kind of weird books. He has Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus, the writer, he was like a hermetic sorcerer. Okay. When you talk about hermetic magic, it's this guy. And that's a real book. They have English translations and things like that. So there's all these real books until, of course, it comes to a book which is conspicuously labeled Qanun-i-Islam, which he finds out later is actually the Necronomicon.
Well, he finds out immediately. I mean, he takes it down, he opens it up, and he's like, "Oh, this is the Necronomicon." I just imagine that Kerwin made up a really bad cover for the book, made out of a paper bag, and just wrote a different name
like
on
in high school.
Yeah, exactly. And in that paragraph where he talks about the Necronomicon, there's a little reference there.
Yeah, he talks about the Necronomicon was spoken of years previously after the exposure of nameless rites at a strange little fishing village in Kingsport.
That's the festival.
It's from the festival. But this is obviously predates the festival, because the festival was, I think that was in the 1920s. The story was set.
Good call.
And this is in the
But that had been happening for centuries.
Yeah, so he's again, Lovecraft's kind of tying in his mythology.
Now, Mr. Merritt is most disturbed by a copy of Borellus that he finds, and it's got a passage in it that's underlined and underlined and underlined, and it's that passage that we heard at the beginning of the show about creating your own Noah's Ark in your study. I don't know why anybody would want to do that, but that's pretty funny. But it's this theory that you can raise from remains or dust an actual person.
Yeah.
Now the sailors that work for Kerwin, I mean, they're the ones that talk the most shit, honestly.
Yeah.
And those sailors that work for him, they disappear in kind of alarming numbers. Too.
Yeah. He has a quick turnaround for his sailors for some reason, and people never see them again. But he pays well.
The talk really gets going though when there's these two regiments of soldiers who come through town. They're stationed in Providence on their way to Louisiana, or New France as they called it then, and a bunch of those soldiers disappear.
They're just gone.
And people that saw Kerwin speaking with them, so they sort of think, what did he do? But another thing he's got in his favor is, like most evil people, he's also really rich, and he's great at business.
Yeah, he's got a monopoly on the whole saltpeter, black pepper, and cinnamon trade. So he's a powerful guy, and so whatever wackiness or strange things that are afoot, he's able to either bribe people or pay them off.
And he also, he does all these sort of civic deeds. He contributes charities and he builds buildings.
There was a colony house that burnt down, and he was the one that helped rebuild it. He did a lot of community stuff.
By the mid 1700s, he seems to realize that he probably should be doing more of that and put on a better public face because people are just talking too much. That gets us into the next section.
The sight of this strange, pallid man, hardly middle-aged in aspect, yet certainly not less than a full century old, seeking at last to emerge from a cloud of fright and detestation too vague to pin down or analyze, was at once a pathetic, a dramatic, and a contemptible thing.
I like that sentence a lot.
It's pretty crazy if you think about, like, people are really turning a blind eye to the fact that this dude is over 100 years old and he looks like he's in his mid-30s,
Right.
which is
Yeah.
pretty crazy, especially in a
It's really crazy.
really superstitious period of history. But since he's got so much money, he's able to really mostly gloss things over.
Sailors stopped disappearing at around this time, but he does start to import large amounts of slaves.
Right, and he stops making his graveyard appearances too. That was another thing about
Right.
Kerwin. He would often be seen, wandering around graveyards, but he stopped doing that
Yeah.
entirely.
Well, here's the thing. He needs a lot of money to do whatever it is he's doing out there in that farmhouse. And that money comes to him through his shipping trade, so he sort of has to stay put and keep running his business.
Yeah.
Even though people are suspicious. So he's got to do kind of really crazy things to keep people from getting in his business. And the people that are working for him, they don't like him, but he blackmails them into staying
Yeah.
with him. The way that he does that is by knowing things about them that
Yeah.
seem like impossible for him to know. He's got secrets from long dead people that he's using to blackmail these.
So how's he getting those things?
Who knows?
Who knows?
Well, at one point he thinks, what I need to do is I need a wife.
Yep.
Then maybe people will give me a break.
Right.
Now, he might have needed the wife for more reason than one.
Oh, right,
It's-
yes.
It's a little more than
It might be
than
more
just,
than just trying to keep up appearances. But at this point in the story, he just says he needs a wife. There's this guy, his name's Duddy Tillinghast, and he is a captain that works for Kerwin, and he's got a daughter named Eliza, who is just 18 years old. Duddy says, of course you can marry my daughter, but she's already engaged to this other guy, Ezra Whedon, and her father just has the final say, so her engagement is broken off, and she marries Kerwin.
Yeah, and Kerwin, he blackmailed this man. This was a forced marriage in a way. He's got some dirt on him.
Yeah.
The man doesn't have a lot of fortune, so he doesn't have a good dowry for his daughter or
No.
anything like that. Kerwin really is victimizing this family to get the young girl.
Her fiance, Ezra Whedon, who was the second mate on a ship called the Enterprise.
Yeah, I know. The Enterprise gets mentioned a few times.
Yeah, it does. Kerwin makes a big mistake because Ezra is really ticked about this and holds a grudge, and he has made an enemy, a serious enemy
Yes.
in this Ezra.
Well, the marriage happens, and people do kind of chill out a bit. Kerwin, he's out at the farm all the time, but he's real good to the wife. He seems to defer to her and treat her well.
Mm-hmm.
They have a child, Anne, who's born in 1765.
A girl.
And around that time, too, he sits for a portrait by Cosmo Alexander, who is a real guy.
Who is
as
a
well,
real painter.
painter.
Yes.
And
We should put a link up to
this
some
likeness-
of Cosmo's stuff on the site just to show people, get an idea of what the painting might have looked like.
He was a portraiture guy, so he's got all of these colonial-ish looking folks. It'll be like a little girl and a lamb or whatever. He's very good.
But he didn't paint it like on a canvas. He painted it on a wall panel in the library of the house on Only
in the
Park.
library. Yeah. Now, around this time, Kerwin he seems very excited about something. Like he's really, whatever work he's doing out at that farm, he's pretty happy about it.
Mm-hmm.
And he's getting involved in politics and civics and doing everything he can. People are actually sort of on his, actually kind of like Kerwin a little bit at this point.
Yeah.
But Ezra, that jilted fiance, he doesn't like it, and
Nope.
he's out there watching.
No,
that
he
farm
knows
all the
that
time.
the guy's a jerk. I mean, the stuff that he was doing, he helped found a bookstore, a bookshop in the town.
Right.
He helped the newspaper that was struggling at the time. Kerwin did all this stuff. He was helping Governor Hopkins get elected. So he's definitely become a real serious player. But Ezra's not falling for it.
And as much as he's getting involved in those civics things, he's also, though, he's spending more time out at the farm, and he's even leaving his business up to his captains. Ezra keeps watching, and he notices that Kerwin's not importing slaves anymore. He used to bring these slaves in and keep them all in that sort of stone tower, but he is bringing in these long boxes instead that he's taking out to the same place. I'm not talking about comic books either. These are,
Coffins. They're coffins.
he can get away with a lot of this because smuggling was sort of commonplace at this time in the the 1760s, considering the all of the different taxation issues. It was almost patriotic to be smuggling all sorts of different things into the colony. So because of the political environment, he's able to get away with a lot of it. Now Ezra, he's got a job, he's got a sale, so he gets another one of his drinking buddies, Eleazar Smith, to help him out in his surveillance of Kerwin. And they decide, let's not make a stink about anything yet because we don't want to warn him off, but let's just keep collecting evidence. And one thing that they mentioned there is that they really actually believe that there's the farmhouse and there's that tower, but there's actually some catacombs beneath the farm where they hear all sorts of different voices coming from.
Whedon had many verbatim reports of overheard scraps in his notebook, for English, French, and Spanish, which he knew were frequently used. But of these, nothing has survived. He did, however, say that besides a few ghoulish dialogues in which the past affairs of Providence families were concerned, most of the questions and answers he could understand were historical or scientific, occasionally pertaining to very remote places and ages. Once, for example, an alternately raging and sullen figure was questioned, in French, about the Black Prince's massacre at Limoges in 1370, as if there was some hidden reason which he ought to know. Curwen asked the prisoner, if prisoner it were, whether the order to slay was given because of the sign of the goat found on the altar in the ancient Roman crypt beneath the cathedral, or whether the dark man of the Haute-Vienne coven had spoken the three words. Failing to obtain replies, the inquisitor had seemingly resorted to extreme means, for there was a terrific shriek, followed by silence and muttering and a bumping sound.
Very creepy
stuff.
He can't see anything that's going on. This is just things that have been heard.
Well, the one time he does see a shadow against one of the windows once during one of these interrogations, and it gives him such a start that the servants hear him out there, Ezra, and they sick the dogs on him. He gets bitten up by the dogs, and then those conversations he doesn't hear out of the farmhouse anymore. They go underground.
Yep.
And people other than Ezra have heard voices coming out of the ground.
Out of the ground, faint
like
cries,
that.
just out of solid earth, far away from any structures and stuff. It's totally crazy. So really, he's pretty sure that there are these catacombs. Something is underneath. He doesn't know if they were built or if they're natural or what, but there has to be something under there. And then finally, there's some heavy rains in 1769, and part of the riverbank collapsed from the flooding, and it showed that there was a cavern, but the cavern had caved in. He was gonna try and dig in there and see if they could clear that away and get inside the caverns, but it never happened.
But one thing that is significant is that some human and animal bones get washed out.
Exactly. Now, they say that there's a lot of Indian burial grounds and things like that around there, so it's not too uncommon that human remains would pop up, but...
Whedon and Smith know what's up. Now, in 1770, there's another curious incident when customs agents inspect this Spanish ship that's coming from Egypt to Providence, and they find that it's full of mummies. Egyptian mummies. Yeah. And everybody knows, who else is shipping mummies into Providence? But he tries to kind of play it off. It says...
As if conscious of this natural belief, Curwen took care to speak casually on several occasions of the chemical value of the balsams found in mummies, thinking perhaps that he might make the affair seem less unnatural, yet stopping just short of admitting his participation.
That is my favorite part of this whole section. What is he... How is he bringing it up? I see you have a bad case of acne. If you rub a little mummy on that would really be helpful. A little mummy on your face takes care of that.
Yeah, get a little mummy. If I have a little indigestion, I'm not feeling well, I do some mummy tea. I make a little mummy tea.
A little bit of mummy tea.
It'll calm your tummy right down. You'll feel much better.
Yep.
I say, this is what I say, mummy for the tummy.
Oh man, I love it. He's a genius in so many ways, but I just imagine he was everybody's going to know about my mummies being important. How can I bring this up casually? We talked about the animal bones and the human bones, but in the spring people are seeing some other strange things in the river.
Of course, the Patuxent is a long river which winds through many settled regions abounding in graveyards. And of course, the spring rains had been very heavy. But the fisher folk about the bridge did not like the wild way that one of the things stared as it shot down to the still water below, or the way that another half cried out, although its condition had greatly departed from that of objects which normally cry out.
So little half creature things that are still conscious are floating in the river. So 1770 hits, and Ezra Whedon and his buddy, they decide, we got to tell some folks what's up. We've got enough data. So they get a hold of Captain Mathewson, who is the captain of the Enterprise, pre-Pike, pre-Archer, all these guys. He says, all right, I dig what you're saying. I always had suspicions about this guy, too. I'm going to go out and I'm going to figure out who the right people are to talk to. So Mathewson, he picks his confidence from among some of the best minds in Providence.
Yeah, this is kind of the Magnificent Seven part, sort of, where he kind of goes around and finds all these really badass guys. Like first Dr. Benjamin West, who had this pamphlet on Venus. He's a scholar. He knows all this stuff. And Reverend James Manning, president of the college. Ex-governor Stephen Hopkins, who's a member of the Philosophical Society. So he's not only a governor, he's really philosophy. He's really smart and John Carter, publisher of the Gazette. And don't forget about the four Brown brothers, John, Joseph, Nicholas, Moses.
Yeah, I love it, man. He assembles a posse of learned men.
Yeah.
Or it reminds me of Dracula a little bit. There's the aged, mystical villain, and then there's this sort of posse of doctors and scholars who have to get together to try and defeat him. They decide the best way to go is to put together a little private raiding party. We'll get this party together. We'll go out to the farm. We'll confront Kerwin. If it just turns out that he's schizophrenic and he's in there babbling to himself, we'll put him in a hospital or whatever. If it turns out to be something else, we'll deal with it.
While these serious steps were under discussion, there occurred in the town an incident so terrible and inexplicable that for a time, little else was mentioned for miles around. In the middle of a moonlit January night with heavy snow underfoot, there resounded over the river and up the hill a shocking series of cries, which brought sleepy heads to every window, and people around Weybosset Point saw a great white thing plunging frantically along the badly cleared space in front of the Turk's Head. There was a baying of dogs in the distance, but this subsided as soon as the clamor of the awakened town became audible. Parties of men with lanterns and muskets hurried out to see what was happening, but nothing rewarded the search. The next morning, however, a giant, muscular body, stark naked, was found on the jams of ice around the southern piers of the great bridge, where the long docks stretched out beside Abbott's distill house. And the identity of this object became a theme for endless speculation and whispering. It was not so much the younger as the older folk who whispered, for only in the patriarchs did that rigid face with horror-bulging eyes strike any chord of memory. They, shaking as they did so, exchanged furtive murmurs of wonder and fear, for in those stiff, hideous features lay a resemblance so marvelous as to be almost an identity. And that identity was with a man who had died full 50 years before.
Whoa.
Yeah, so this is like Reanimator, where the experiments are getting away.
Yeah, exactly. This dude, naked dude, ran out in the snow. I mean, they found his body out on an ice float. Must not have been
Pretty creepy.
a pleasant end to that guy.
And the tracks, Ezra checks it out, and the tracks go to Kerwin's
Back to Kerwin's farm.
And the body is identified by some folks.
Yep,
actually.
they find out that it is the long-dead blacksmith Daniel Green.
Whose great-grandson works for Kerwin.
Exactly.
And when they go and they check it out, they find out that Daniel Green's coffin his
grave is empty. Yep, not there.
At this point, the posse, they start intercepting Kerwin's mail.
Yeah, they want to know what the heck's going on. And the first letter they get from him is this letter from Jedediah Orne of Salem.
And it seems from this letter that Jedediah and Kerwin are sort of sharing info about their experiments. One interesting sentence in there, it says,
I say unto you again, do not call up any that you cannot put down. By the which I mean any that can in turn call up somewhat against you, whereby your powerfulest devices may not be of use.
A little warning in there that's going to come into...
Yeah, that's probably going to come to fruition at some point in the story.
Yeah. And Jedediah also says, hey, by the way, when you write me back, don't call me Simon. Call me Jedediah, because I came back as my own son. He's just really clear about it. Jedediah has a better plan than Kerwin.
Yeah, exactly.
He's actually pretends to be a different person so that people don't think it's weird that he's like 100 years old.
Yeah, exactly. He goes, oh, no, that was my dad. They're like, wow, you look just like your dad. Yeah, I do, don't I? Isn't that neat?
And they intercept another letter from Philadelphia, and it's similar. It seems to be complaining about somebody who's trying to call up stuff from imperfect remains.
Yeah, he doesn't have all of it.
Kinds of problems. And then they intercept a third letter that's in an ancient alphabet they can't even read.
Yeah, they don't know. They don't know. But in the future, when Charles Dexter Ward is able to find these letters, remember, we're going through this with Charles. His research has brought all this stuff to light. That's how we're getting all this information. Right, yeah. Charles takes it and finds out that it is an Aramaic or Abyssinian. Is that how it's pronounced?
Yeah. It's people shouldn't be writing letters.
Yeah, but that's the alphabet. But nobody recognizes any of the words.
And here's a good place for us to maybe come to a conclusion for this segment. But Kerwin, despite all the precautions he's taken, he kind of knows there's something in the wind.
Yeah, he smells it.
He thinks that something's going on. And one night, the Fenners, his neighbors, they see this light shooting into the sky from his concrete tower.
Yeah. He has an aperture in the roof of the tower. And a big beam of light shoots out of it, which is pretty crazy in the 1700s to have a giant beam of light shooting out of a building.
Right. So he's making some plans of his own in advance of a confrontation that he believes is going to happen, in which we will discuss on our next episode.
Our next episode, which will be part 2 of the case of Charles Dexter Ward.
Wow.
I want to thank Matt Foyer for doing such a wonderful job.
Yeah, he's great, and we're going to have him for the duration of our coverage of the story.
Yes, he will be reading for us.
There's so much cool stuff in here, man. I thought we were going to get through more in this episode, but
no,
we're running short on time.
We're going to have to save it. We're going to save it because it's really exciting, and I don't want to skip over it.
So in our next episode, we'll talk about that big battle royale.
One last thing I wanted to mention briefly. This coming Saturday, September 11th, the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival will be coming to Los Angeles, to the Warner Grand Theater in San Pedro. I'm going to head out there to support the Call of Cthulhu, which is showing in the evening before a screening of Reanimator, which I believe Stuart Gordon is coming to introduce as well. Screenings start at 2 p.m. They're showing 6 of the best movies that have played at the original festival in Portland over the last 14 years that festival has been going on. So if you're in the area, come by, say hello. I'd love to meet you. We'll put a link up to the official film festival site in the show notes. Hope to see you there.
And with that, I'm Chris Lackey.
I'm Chad Pfeiffer.
And this has been the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
hppodcraft.com.